The enzymes that we use to label our secondary antibodies are not structurally stable at room temperature, and that's the reason why we recommend that you image your chemiluminescent Western blot membrane as soon as the protocol is completed. Meaning that as soon as you're done with your secondary antibody incubation and the subsequent washes, you go ahead, add the substrate, and acquire your image. That's going to help ensure that all of the enzymes that are present on the membrane are still active and capable of producing photons of light, increasing data accuracy. Use a substrate that is adequate for your detection method. Substrates vary both on the rate of the reaction and the duration of the reaction. Therefore, substrates that may be appropriate for film detection could not work on digital imagers. Typically, when we're using a digital imager, we need to use a substrate that is capable of producing photons of light that are stronger, because those photons are going to have to travel farther to the detector than they would to the film. You want to choose a substrate that is also appropriate for your targets. Again, substrates are going to be changing on the duration of the reaction as well as on photon intensity. So different substrates are going to be better for different types of targets. For example, if I need to image a low abundance target, I probably want to choose a substrate that produces strong photons of light throughout a longer period of time, allowing my film or my detector additional time to capture all of that signal. On the other hand, if I use that same extremely sensitive substrate on a high abundance target, I will typically run into issues with saturation and increased background. So make sure you carefully select which substrate is going to be appropriate for your target. An alternative to that is using an instrument that has a broad dynamic range, such as the AutoCFC, which allows you to capture all of your bands in one unique image, despite of how faint or how bright those bands may be. Once you have determined which substrate works well for your targets, you want to keep that substrate consistent. You don't want to change substrates throughout your experiments. Remember that different substrates are going to produce either more or less signal, which translates into either stronger or fainter bands. And if you do that and you change your substrate throughout your experiments, you're not going to be able to compare the data obtained from different membranes. Always follow the recommendations that are specific for your particular substrate. In most cases, the datasheet is going to recommend that you mix reagents A and B in a 1-to-1 ratio. Reagent A typically being the luminol enhancer solution and reagent B typically being the peroxidase solution. However, that can change from kit to kit. So again, double check the datasheet of your substrate and make sure you follow all of their recommendations. I know at times it can be tempting to spike your substrate to increase the sensitivity by just a little bit. However, when you do that, you really change the enzymatic reaction, so that's not recommended. Same thing applies when you want to dilute your substrate to reduce the sensitivity a little bit. That also affects the enzymatic reaction in a non-reproducible way, so it's not recommended. So if you're running into one of those two issues that you need to adjust the sensitivity of your assay, what we recommend is that you either optimize your protocol, or that you change your exposure settings, or that you change your substrate altogether. Never spike or dilute your substrate. If you store your substrate at 4 degrees Celsius, like it is recommended for several substrates, you want to bring it to room temperature before you use it. That's going to help ensure that that enzymatic reaction is happening at the same pace every time that you use that substrate. You also want to make sure that you use enough volume to fully cover the membrane. I know that substrates aren't cheap, but this is not where you want to try and save a couple bucks, because if you don't have enough substrate, that's going to influence the rate of that reaction and really compromise data accuracy. Check the data sheet of your particular substrate, but you will see that the majority of them recommend using 0.1 milliliters of substrate for every square centimeter of membrane. That roughly translates into 3 milliliters of substrate for a 4 by 7 centimeter membrane. Once you have determined how much substrate you should be using on your membranes, make sure you keep that volume of substrate consistent throughout all of your experiments, since changing that volume will really affect data reproducibility and accuracy. You also want to make sure that you have enough volume to cover the entire membrane evenly every single time. That's going to help ensure that all areas of the membrane have access to the same amount of substrate to keep that reaction going throughout the entire imaging session. If you are considering adding a plastic protector on top of your membrane after you have added your substrate, we recommend caution, as there are several factors to take into consideration. Depending on your detection system and for film, it may actually be recommended that you use that plastic protector, as it will prevent the direct contact of the substrate with your film or with your detector. It will also help ensure that the substrate is evenly spread across the entire membrane. However, it is important to be aware that adding that plastic protector is going to reduce the amount of substrate that is available for the enzymatic reaction, facilitating you running into substrate depletion much faster. On top of that, anything that you place on top of the membrane, it's going to work as a barrier, reducing the number of photons of light that can actually reach the detector or your film. On top of that, if you don't properly clean that plastic protector, it's going to be a source of background. So we just recommend that you're careful and you double check what plastic is compatible for your system and if it's even recommended that you use one. If you do need or choose to use a plastic protector, just make sure you always keep it clean. It is also very important that you place the membrane in the correct orientation in your detection system, with the protein side facing the detector or the film. If you place the membrane incorrectly, the membrane itself is going to work as a barrier to the photons of light, really compromising the sensitivity of your assay. In this lesson, we have talked a lot about substrate best practices, and now on the next lesson, we're going to focus on the best practices on how to acquire your image.